The gravel crunched under the tires of the rented Ford Escape, the sound disproportionately loud in the unnerving silence. St. Elmo, Colorado, wasn't so much a town as a scattering of weathered wood and fading memories clinging to the side of the Rockies. Most of the buildings were boarded up, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin, staring out with vacant, hollow eyes. A single, rusted gas pump stood sentinel before a defunct general store, its numbers long since blurred by time and weather. October had bled into November, and a persistent wind knifed through the narrow streets, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else. Something older, something like dust and regret. Ava Maxwell pulled up to the only establishment that looked remotely inhabited, the St. Elmo Hotel, or what was left of it. 2 stories of sagging timbers, with a porch that threatened to collapse with every gust of wind. A hand-painted sign, barely clinging to the facade, proclaimed, "Rooms, find if you dare." Charming. She killed the engine, the sudden quiet amplifying the thrumming in her ears. This was it, St. Elmo, the last known location of Sarah Jenkins. 6 months vanished. No body, no leads, just whispers. Ava was a true crime podcaster. Cold cases, dark corners was her vehicle, and she'd built a decent following piecing together forgotten tragedies, giving voice to the voiceless. But her last case hadn't gone well. The memory hit her like a physical blow. The stark white of the interrogation room, the lead detective's disappointed gaze, the mother's heartbroken wail. The Harding case. A young woman gone missing from a hiking trail, a prime suspect released for lack of evidence, and Ava, convinced she'd missed something vital, had been wrong, publicly, painfully wrong. Her credibility had taken a hit. Accusations of sensationalism had followed, and the relentless hum of self-doubt had become a constant companion. This case, the Jenkins disappearance, was a chance to redeem herself, a chance to prove she could still see the truth. She grabbed her recording equipment, a small backpack containing microphones, a digital recorder, and a notebook. The weight felt less reassuring than usual. Old Man Hemlock, the hotel's proprietor, was a study in leathery resilience. He opened the door before she could knock. His face, a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes the pale blue of glacial ice. "You, the podcaster?" he rasped, his voice sounding like stones grinding together. "Ava Maxwell." "That is right," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm here about Sarah Jenkins." Hemlock's gaze didn't soften. "Heard about you. Digging up ghosts, are ya? Just trying to find answers," he grunted. Answers are buried deep in this town, and some things are best left buried. He gestured inside with a gnarled hand. "Room 7. It is the only one I bother keeping aired out. Don't expect luxury." Room 7 was austere. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light filtering through the grimy windows. A chipped enamel wash basin, a rickety bed with a threadbare quilt, and a single, straight-backed chair. The air smelled of mildew and decay. Ava dropped her backpack onto the floor, a hollow echo in the silent room. "Anything you can tell me about Sarah?" she asked, turning back to Hemlock, who hadn't moved from the doorway. "She was a tourist, came through like dozens of others, looking for a bit of the Old West, took pictures, bought some souvenirs, seemed a nice enough girl." "Did she mention where she was from?" "Who she was traveling with? Said she was tucking, a solo trip, needed to get away." He paused, scrutinizing Ava. "That is all she said. The sheriff's report said she was last seen hiking up to the mine. That is what they say." Hemlock's tone was deliberately ambiguous. Ava frowned. "You don't think she went to the mine?" "I didn't say that. I said things ain't always what they seem in St. Elmo." The sheriff's report. Ava pulled it up on her tablet. Sheriff Brody, a name she'd only interacted with through emails, had been less than enthusiastic about her investigation. He'd cooperated with the basics, footy access to the report, a brief phone interview, but she sensed a reluctance, a desire to let the case remain cold. A local girl, the report stated, mentioned seeing Sarah talking to a man near the saloon the night before she disappeared. Unidentified, no further information. She thanked Hemlock and headed back out into the grey afternoon. The town was eerily quiet. A few other buildings showed faint signs of life, a curio shop with a faded open sign, a saloon with dusty windows. But there were no people, just the wind whistling through the empty structures, a mournful, unsettling sound. She walked toward the saloon. The claim jumper, its swinging doors hanging askew. The wood was warped and cracked, the paint long gone. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale beer and forgotten dreams. She found Maggie, the owner, wiping down the already spotless bar. Maggie was a woman carved from the same hard rock as the surrounding mountains. Her face was weathered, her eyes sharp and observant. "Heard you were poking around about Sarah Jenkins," Maggie said without preamble. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Just trying to understand what happened," Ava replied, keeping her voice even. "Folks around here don't like talking about it." Maggie's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Why not? Elmo's got a history, a long one. And sometimes the past has a way of clinging on." "What kind of history?" Maggie hesitated, then sighed. "Stories, legends. Folks say this town is haunted. By the miners who died in the collapse, by the outlaws who used to hide in these mountains, by all the broken hearts and shattered dreams that have passed through here." "You believe in ghosts?" Ava asked. "I believe in things people don't understand," Maggie said cryptically. "Sarah Jenkins, she was asking questions about the mine, about the old families, about things best left alone." "What kind of questions?" "I didn't pry, wasn't my business, but she was digging. That much I know, and some folks don't appreciate digging." Maggie glanced over Ava's shoulder as if expecting someone to be listening. "This town protects its secrets." Ava interviewed a few more residents. A retired carpenter named Silas, a woman who ran the curio shop, old man Tiber, who claimed to be a descendant of one of the original miners. Each conversation was the same, guarded responses, veiled warnings, a pervasive sense of unease. No one offered any concrete information, but the collective message was clear. Saint Elmo wasn't welcoming outsiders and wasn't eager to dredge up the past. As dusk settled, casting long skeletal shadows across the town, Ava found herself drawn to the St. Elmo Hotel. It loomed over the landscape, a dark, brooding presence. She'd asked Hemlock for the key to the rest of the building, telling him she wanted to get a feel for the place. He'd reluctantly complied, handing her a heavy iron key with a warning. "Don't go wandering where you don't belong." The hotel's interior was a labyrinth of decaying hallways and empty rooms. Dust lay thick on everything, a fine grey blanket covering forgotten furniture and faded wallpaper. The air grew colder as she ventured deeper, the silence punctuated only by the creaking of the floorboards and the mournful wail of the wind. She systematically worked her way through the ground floor, documenting the decay, absorbing the atmosphere. Most of the rooms were empty, stripped bare long ago. But then, at the end of a long dark hallway, she found a door that was different. It was partially obscured by a fallen section of plaster, almost hidden in the shadows. Intrigued, Ava tugged at the door. It was locked. She rummaged in her bag for a small set of lockpicks, only a habit she'd developed during her earlier riskier investigations. The Harding case had taught her to be prepared. A few tense minutes later, the lock clicked open. The room was small, crammed with forgotten belongings. A dusty writing desk, a broken rocking chair, a stack of faded quilts. It felt personal, different from the other rooms, which had been abandoned and forgotten. This room had been hidden. She started to sift through the contents of the desk, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Old letters, yellowed photographs, a collection of antique buttons, and then, tucked away in a hidden compartment beneath the desk, she found it, a diary bound in leather, its pages brittle with age. The cover was blank, but as she carefully opened it, she saw a single faded inscription on the first page: Sarah Jenkins. A chill ran down Ava's spine. This wasn't just a clue. This was Sarah Jenkins' voice, frozen in time, and it felt like, finally, she was about to hear it. She opened the diary, ready to read the first entry, the first glimpse into the mind of the missing woman. But as she began to read, a floorboard creaked behind her. Deliberate, she whipped around, her hand instinctively reaching for the small flashlight in her bag. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and the diary, in her trembling hands, felt suddenly terrifyingly cold. The leather of the diary felt brittle beneath Ava's fingers. It was T. Sarah Jenkins' diary. Not exactly. The first page, penned in elegant cursive, revealed the owner, Elsie Miller, dated 1928. A wave of confusion washed over Ava. Why would Sarah have a diary from almost a century ago? And why was it hidden? She began to read. Elsie's entries started innocently enough. Descriptions of small town life, observations about the weather, the tedious routines of a young woman confined to a forgotten corner of the world. But as the weeks progressed, a subtle shift occurred. A growing sense of unease crept into Elsie's words. The 14th of July. The meetings continue. Old Man Hemlock is always there, and Mrs. Abernathy, of course. They gather at the back of the claim jumper after closing. Always hushed tones, always shadowed faces. I can't make out what they discuss, but it feels important, secretive. Ava paused, her breath catching in her throat. Hemlock, the hotel proprietor. He hadn't mentioned Elsie or the meetings. She continued reading, her eyes scanning the faded ink. The 3rd of August saw Sheriff Brody leaving the claim jumper late tonight. He looked agitated. I tried to ask him what was going on, but he just glared at me and walked away. Everyone in this town is starting to scare me. Sheriff Brody, even back then, was this a pattern, a cycle of silence and intimidation repeating itself across generations? The 17th of August, something strange happened today. I was walking by the old mine when I saw a group of men carrying something. A shape covered in a tarp. They were rushing, looking around nervously. I couldn't see what it was, but it felt wrong, terribly wrong. The descriptions became increasingly fragmented, riddled with paranoia. Elsie wrote of being watched, of whispers following her down the street, of a growing fear that she was uncovering something she shouldn't. The 2nd of September, they know I am watching them. I saw Hemlock looking at me today, his eyes cold and hard. He knows I suspect something. I feel like I am in danger. Sarah is asking questions too, about the history of the mine, about the families. She is a newcomer, like me, and she doesn't understand. This town, it doesn't like outsiders digging around. I tried to warn her, but she wouldn't listen. She said she was a journalist, that she just wanted the truth. The last entry was dated the 10th of September, 1928. It was barely legible, scrawled in a frantic hand. They, recoming for me. I saw them near the church. I have to hide. I know what they did at the mine. I know their secret. They can't let me tell. The entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence. A cold wave of dread washed over Ava. Elsie had disappeared shortly after writing those words. The Historical Society records she'd briefly checked online confirmed it. Elsie Miller vanished without a trace in the fall of 1928. The case had gone unsolved. Another forgotten tragedy in St. Elmo. Its long and troubled history. Ava closed the diary, her hands trembling. Had Sarah stumbled upon the same secret? The similarities were unsettling. Two young women asking questions, both vanishing without a trace. She needed to find out more about Elsie Miller. The next morning, Ava started her search at the town's tiny library, a cramped room above the general store. The librarian, a skeletal woman named Mrs. Gable, eyed her with suspicion. "Looking for something specific, dear?" she asked, her voice raspy with disuse. "Elsie Miller," Ava said. "She lived here in the 1920s. Do you have any records?" Mrs. Gable pursed her lips. "Elsie Miller. Oh yes, a troubled girl, always getting into trouble. Said she saw things, imagined things. A bit of a recluse, really. Did anyone ever take her seriously? Some folks said she was touched, that her mind wasn't right. Others just dismissed her as a busybody. She wasn't well liked, you see, always stirring up trouble." "Did she ever mention anything about the mine?" Mrs. Gable hesitated. "Some say she claimed to have seen something up there, something unnatural. But it was just her stories, dear, wild tales." Ava pressed further, but Mrs. Gable clammed up, offering only vague platitudes and dismissive shrugs. It was the same story she'd heard from everyone else. Elsie Miller was a crazy, unreliable recluse, and her stories were just the ramblings of a disturbed mind. But Ava couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The diary felt too real, too raw, to be the product of a delusional imagination. She spent the rest of the day tracking down anyone who might remember Elsie. Old man Tiber vaguely recalled hearing stories about her as a child, tales of a strange girl who saw things others couldn't. Silas the carpenter dismissed her as a town gossip who made things up. No one offered any concrete information, only fragments of rumor and speculation. As darkness descended, Ava returned to the St. Elmo Hotel, a growing sense of unease settling over her. She parked the rental car in front, then froze. A note was taped to the windshield, scrawled in crude block letters. It read, "Leave St. Elmo. Stop digging." Fear constricted her chest. This wasn't just dismissive hostility. This was a direct threat. Someone didn't want her investigating Sarah Jenkins or Elsie Miller, or the secrets of this town. She ripped the note from the windshield, her hands shaking. She needed to call Sheriff Brody to report the threat, but a part of her hesitated. Would he even take her seriously? She had a feeling he was already protecting someone. She decided to walk to the saloon, hoping to find Hemlock. Maybe he knew more than he was letting on. But as she rounded the corner, she noticed a figure standing in the shadows, watching her. A tall, imposing man with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. He was partially obscured by the darkness, but Ava could feel his gaze burning into her. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man didn't move, just stood there, a silent, menacing presence. She reached the saloon and burst through the doors, nearly colliding with Maggie, who was polishing glasses behind the bar. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Maggie said, raising an eyebrow. I think someone's watching me," Ava stammered, trying to catch her breath. "This town has a lot of eyes," Maggie said, her voice grim. "And a lot of secrets." "I found a diary," Ava said, lowering her voice. "It belonged to a woman named Elsie Miller. She disappeared. She wrote about strange things happening in St. Elmo, about a group of people meeting in secret, and she mentioned Sarah Jenkins." Maggie's expression hardened. She stopped polishing the glasses and stared at Ava, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and warning. "You shouldn't have dug that up," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Some things are best left buried. What do you know about Elsie Miller? Maggie hesitated, then shook her head. Nothing. I don't know anything about Elsie Miller. Ava didn't believe her. She could see the fear in Maggie's eyes, the secrets she was desperately trying to keep hidden. Where is Elsie now? Ava pressed. What happened to her? Maggie looked away, her jaw clenched. I told you, I don't know. Ava pulled out her phone, ready to call the sheriff, but before she could, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Old man Tiber, who had been nursing a drink in a dark corner of the saloon, was gone. He hadn't simply left, his stool was overturned, and a single tarnished silver locket lay on the floor where he'd been sitting. It looked familiar. Ava picked up the locket, her fingers trembling. She opened it. Inside, a miniature portrait of a young woman stared back at her. It was Elsie Miller, and beneath the portrait, a tiny, faded inscription, gone but not forgotten. Suddenly Maggie gasped, her face ashen. Oh no, she breathed. Not again. What? Ava demanded, her voice tight with fear. What is it? Maggie's eyes darted around the saloon, as if expecting someone to burst through the doors. Elsie's granddaughter. She lived here. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. The saloon's air hung thick with dread. Maggie's revelation, Sarah Jenkins, was Elsie Miller's granddaughter, fascinated with a sickening finality. 2 generations linked by a vanished ancestor, and a town steeped in secrets. Cold in Ava's hand, felt like a weight, a tangible connection to a past that refused to stay buried. How did Sarah even know about Elsie's diary? Ava managed, her voice barely a whisper. Maggie shook her head, her face pale. I don't know. It has been passed down through the family. A dark legacy. Elsie's daughter, Martha, never spoke of her mother. It was a closed chapter. But Sarah, she was always curious, always digging. Ava spent a sleepless night in room 7, the weight of the diary pressing down on her. Every creak of the old hotel, every gust of wind rattling the windows, sounded like a footstep. She kept the recording equipment close, a meager reassurance in the oppressive silence. The next morning, a sense of unease followed her, like a shadow. Her recording equipment had been subtly rearranged, the microphone inexplicably turned off. A small, unsettling detail, but enough to convince her she wasn't alone. Someone was watching her, interfering with her investigation. She mentioned it to Sheriff Brody, but he dismissed it as her imagination. Small towns breed paranoia. Ms. Maxwell. Folks are naturally suspicious of outsiders. He offered a condescending smile and little else. Through casual questioning, Ava learned about Caleb Harding. He was a lifelong resident of St. Elmo, a man obsessed with the town's history. He ran the small historical society, cataloguing artifacts and giving tours to the few tourists who ventured this way. But he was also eccentric. Locals described him as a recluse, fiercely protective of St. Elmo's past, and prone to unsettlingly intense monologues. It didn't take long for Caleb Harding to find her. She was photographing the dilapidated mine entrance when he materialized beside her, seemingly out of nowhere. He was a tall, gaunt man with piercing blue eyes and a wild tangle of grey hair. He wore a faded flannel shirt and dusty work boots, blending into the landscape. "Admiring our history, Ms. Maxwell?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Ava turned, startled. "Just documenting it. St. Elmo has a rich and complex past," Caleb said, a strange intensity flickering in his eyes. "A past that many outsiders don't understand." "I'm trying to understand it," Ava said cautiously. "I'm researching the disappearance of Sarah Jenkins." Caleb's expression darkened. Sarah was a good girl. She loved this town. It is a tragedy what happened to her. Do you know anything about her disappearance? He hesitated, studying her with unnerving scrutiny. I've told Sheriff Brody everything I know. What did you tell him? That she was a curious soul. She asked a lot of questions about the mine, about the old families. Some questions are best left unanswered, Miss Maxwell. Ava felt a prickle of unease. What kind of questions? Questions about things that happened a long time ago. Things that are best forgotten. Over the next few days, Caleb seemed to be everywhere Ava went. He'd coincidentally bump into her at the general store, offer unsolicited advice during her interviews, and linger just a little too long. His gaze unnervingly focused. Initially, he offered to help, pointing her towards obscure historical records and sharing anecdotes about the town. But his helpfulness felt calculated. His questions became increasingly intrusive, probing into her reasons for being in St. Elmo, her background, her personal life. You have a strong interest in this case, Miss Maxwell, he said during one of their encounters. His voice, a low murmur, almost too strong. What exactly are you hoping to find? She deflected his questions as best she could, but she felt increasingly uncomfortable. Caleb's presence was suffocating, his intensity unnerving. He wasn't trying to help her, he was monitoring her, controlling her, driven by a growing sense of paranoia. Ava decided to investigate Caleb's background. A search of county records revealed a surprising connection. Caleb Harding was a direct descendant of Silas Abernathy, the same Silas Abernathy mentioned in Elsie Miller's diary as attending the secretive meetings of the Claim Jumper. The connection felt chilling. Had Caleb inherited more than just a family name? Was he carrying on a legacy of secrets and lies? She returned to Elsie's diary, hoping to find more clues. The entries grew increasingly frantic as Elsie delved deeper into her investigation. She described the meetings at the Claim Jumper in greater detail, noting the presence of prominent townspeople, Foon, the sheriff, the mine owner, local businessmen, Foot, all bound together by a shared secret. The 5th of September, I overheard them talking tonight. They spoke of the offering, of keeping the balance. They mentioned the mine and a guardian who must be appeased. The 7th of September, they practiced some kind of ritual. I saw them in the woods near the old chapel. They were wearing robes, chanting strange words. It was terrifying. I felt like I was witnessing something evil. The word ritual jumped out at Ava, a ritualistic aspect to the secretive meetings. What were they trying to appease? What guardian were they talking about? The final entries were filled with terror and paranoia. Elsie feared for her life, convinced that the group was closing in on her. She wrote of hiding the diary, hoping that someone someday would uncover the truth. Ava was rereading the 8th of September entry, the one mentioning Sarah Jenkins being warned, when she found something tucked between the pages. A photograph. It was old and faded sepia, toned and cracked with age. It depicted a group of people standing in a clearing in the woods. In the center stood a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Sarah Jenkins, her face full of youthful optimism. Standing beside her was Elsie Miller, her expression hesitant and uncertain. And beside Elsie, a young boy, no more than 10 years old, stared out from the photograph with unnervingly cold, calculating eyes. It was Caleb Harding. The three of them were arranged around a stone altar, draped with dark fabric. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, and flickering candles cast eerie shadows on their faces. They weren't simply standing there, they were participating in something, a ceremony. Ava's blood ran cold. The photograph wasn't just a snapshot of the past, it was a glimpse into a darkness that still lingered in St. Elmo, a darkness that Caleb Harding was protecting. As she stared at the photograph, a shadow fell across the page. She looked up, her heart pounding. Caleb was standing in the doorway, his face expressionless. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't said a word. He just stood there, watching her. Interesting find, he said finally, his voice dangerously soft. Some things are best left in the past, Ms. Maxwell. He reached out and slowly, deliberately, closed the diary. The image of young Caleb Harding, his eyes devoid of warmth, haunted Ava. The photograph wasn't simply disturbing. It was a key to unlocking the secrets of St. Elmo and possibly Sarah Jenkins' disappearance. She spent the next day immersed in research, scouring historical archives and forgotten texts. The library at the county courthouse yielded a treasure trove of information about St. Elmo's early settlers signed a group of hardscrabble miners and pioneers who had arrived in the mountains in the late 1800s, and she found something else. Faint, disturbing references to an ancient mountain deity, known only as the Watcher. Local folklore described the Watcher as a powerful enigmatic being worshipped by the Ute Native American tribe who originally inhabited the area. The settlers, desperate for luck in the treacherous mines, had adopted some of the tribe's rituals, attempting to appease the Watcher and ensure a bountiful harvest of silver and gold. The rituals, the texts hinted, involved offerings, sacrifices, and a ceremony performed during the winter solstice time, when the veil between worlds was said to be thin. The symbols carved onto the altar in the photograph matched depictions of ancient Ute petroglyphs, linking the ceremony to the deity. It wasn't just folklore. Elsie's diary hinted at something deeper, something far more sinister. The phrase, keeping the balance, kept resurfacing in her entries. Balance with whom? With what? Ava began to piece together a timeline. Elsie discovered the ceremony in the summer of 1928. Sarah Jenkins arrived in St. Elmo 6 months before her disappearance, also asking questions about the town's history. Both women drawn into the same web of secrets, and both vanishing around the time of the winter solstice. The solstice was fast approaching. The 21st of December, that evening, Caleb Harding found her at the claim jumper, her laptop glowing in the dim light. He didn't bother with pleasantries. You are digging where you don't belong, Miss Maxwell, he said, his voice dangerously low. You are disturbing the peace of this town, desecrating our heritage. Ava didn't flinch. I'm trying to find out what happened to Sarah Jenkins. Sarah's disappearance was a tragedy, but it is over. Let it rest. You know more than you're letting on, Caleb. His eyes narrowed. I'm protecting St. Elmo. I'm preserving its history. You wouldn't understand. He leaned closer, his voice a menacing whisper. I'm warning you. Stop your investigation. Leave this town before you get hurt. The threat hung in the air like a shroud. Ava forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to show fear. I'm not leaving, she said, her voice firm. I'm not going to let you silence me. Caleb's jaw tightened. He turned and stalked out of the saloon, leaving Ava shaken but resolute. She knew she was walking a dangerous path, but she couldn't turn back. The truth was too important. She needed to find someone who knew more about the town's history, someone who wasn't afraid to speak their mind. Old Man Tiber, despite his initial reticence, had mentioned a local historian, Arthur Penhaligon, who lived on a remote farm outside of town. Penhaligon was an eccentric old man, surrounded by stacks of books and forgotten artifacts. He agreed to talk to Ava, but only after she promised to keep their conversation confidential. St. Elmo has a dark side, child, he said, his voice raspy with age, a side that most folks prefer to ignore. He confirmed Ava's suspicions about the ceremony and the Watcher. He explained that the early settlers, desperate and superstitious, had believed that the Watcher demanded sacrifices to ensure the prosperity of the mine. It wasn't about worship, not really, Penhaligon said, his eyes clouded with sadness. It was about control, about appeasing a force they didn't understand. Then he revealed a chilling detail. There have been other disappearances over the years. Young men, young women, always around the winter solstice. The locals whisper that the watcher takes what it is owed. The disappearances were never solved, Ava asked, her voice barely a whisper. No, always dismissed as accidents, runaways, or simply people getting lost in the mountains. But I've always suspected there was something more to it. He paused, studying Ava. Look closely at the town records, child. You'll find a pattern, a disturbing pattern. Penhaligon cautiously shared fragmented historical records, detailing a series of unsolved disappearances dating back to the early 1900s each occurring around the winter solstice. The victims were always young, healthy, and connected to the mine in some way. Back at the St. Elmo Hotel, Ava returned to Elsie. His diary, her mind reeling from Penhaligon's revelations. She examined the diary more closely. Running her fingers along the worn leather cover, it felt strange, uneven. She noticed a subtle seam along the spine, almost invisible to the naked eye. She carefully pried it open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, she found a small folded map drawn on parchment. It depicted the area surrounding St. Elmo, with a specific location marked with a bold X Tuvin, a remote clearing several miles outside of town, nestled deep within the mountains. The clearing was located near an abandoned chapel Penhaligon had mentioned, a chapel shrouded in local legend. Beneath the map, another small item, a dried, crimson flower pressed between two sheets of parchment. She didn't recognize the species, and as she held it to her nose, a faint, metallic scent filled the air, the scent of blood. The biting wind whipped at Ava's face as she navigated the treacherous mountain road. The map, brittle with age, led her deeper and deeper into the wilderness surrounding St. Elmo, away from the decaying remnants of civilization and towards a chilling solitude. The Ford Escape strained against the steep incline, its tires struggling for traction on the icy gravel. After hours of driving, she reached the coordinates marked on the map, a clearing shrouded in shadow, nestled between towering pines, and in the center of the clearing a cabin. It wasn't dilapidated like the buildings in St. Elmo. It was meticulously maintained, smoke curling from its chimney, a stark contrast to the surrounding decay. A knot of dread tightened in Ava's stomach. This was it, the heart of the secret. She parked the car a safe distance away and approached the cabin cautiously, her hand gripping the small canister of pepper spray she carried for protection. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and something else, something acrid and metallic, reminiscent of the dried flower she'd found in Elsie's diary. Peeking through a window, she saw a room furnished with rough, hewn furniture and adorned with strange symbols carved into the wooden walls. An altar, draped with dark fabric, stood in the center of the room, identical to the one depicted in the photograph. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a scattering of animal bones lay on the floor. This wasn't just a cabin, it was a shrine, a place of ritual. She tried the door, locked. She used her lockpicks, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. A click, the door swung open, revealing the interior in all its unsettling glory. The cabin was eerily clean, as if someone had been preparing for a visitor or a ceremony. She moved deeper inside, documenting everything with her camera. She found a collection of journals filled with Caleb Harding's handwriting. They detailed his unwavering belief in the Watcher, his conviction that the ceremony was essential to protect St. Elmo from external forces, and his growing paranoia about outsiders interfering with the town's traditions. Then she found it, a photograph album. It contained images of the cabin over the years, each picture documenting the continuation of the rituals. And in the most recent photographs, she saw Sarah Jenkins. She wasn't a captive. She was participating. A wave of nausea washed over Ava. Sarah hadn't been kidnapped. She'd willingly joined Caleb and his followers. The truth twisted in her gut. a brutal betrayal of her initial assumptions. Suddenly, a voice shattered the silence. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Maxwell." Caleb Harding stood in the doorway, blocking her escape. His eyes burned with fanaticism, his face contorted with rage. He held a hunting rifle, its barrel aimed directly at her. "What is this?" Ava demanded, trying to maintain her composure. "What have you done?" "I'm protecting you, Elmo," Caleb said, his voice trembling with conviction. "This town is special. It is a sanctuary, and it needs to be protected from outsiders who would corrupt it by sacrificing people." Caleb's jaw tightened. "It is not sacrifice. It is an offering, a necessary offering to appease the Watcher and ensure the survival of our town." "Sarah Jenkins," Ava began, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah understood, Caleb said, a strange light flickering in his eyes. She saw the truth. She believed in the power of the Watcher. She willingly offered herself for the good of St. Elmo. Ava couldn't believe it. Sarah, a journalist searching for the truth, had become a believer, a willing participant in this macabre ritual. But something didn't add up. Elsie's diary hinted at a darker truth, a hidden conflict. "Elsie knew, didn't she?" Ava said, her voice rising. "Elsie knew what you were really doing." Caleb's expression hardened. Elsie was unstable, delusional. She couldn't understand the importance of our traditions. "She tried to expose you," Ava accused. "That is why she disappeared. She threatened the balance. She had to be silenced." Caleb raised the rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Ava reacted instinctively, diving behind an overturned table. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the cabin. A splinter of wood grazed her arm. A struggle ensued, a desperate dance between truth and fanaticism. Ava grabbed a heavy iron candlestick and swung it at Caleb, connecting with his arm. He stumbled back, dropping the rifle. She lunged for it, but he tackled her to the ground, pinning her beneath his weight. "You don't understand, Miss Maxwell," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You don't understand the sacrifices we have to make." Ava managed to wriggle free. Scrambling to her feet, she raced towards the door, but Caleb grabbed her ankle, sending her crashing to the floor. She kicked out blindly, connecting with his knee. He let out a grunt of pain, releasing his grip. She scrambled to her feet and bolted out of the cabin, sprinting towards the car. Caleb was close behind, his heavy footsteps pounding the ground. She reached the car, fumbled with the keys, and managed to start the engine. She slammed the car into gear and sped away, leaving Caleb shouting threats in the dust. He pursued her on foot, his relentless figure a terrifying silhouette against the backdrop of the mountains. The road was treacherous, winding, and icy. Ava navigated the curves with desperate skill. Glancing in the rearview mirror, Caleb was gaining on her, his determination fueled by fanaticism. She swerved to avoid a patch of black ice, losing control of the car. It skidded across the road and slammed into a snowdrift. She was trapped. Caleb emerged from the trees, his face contorted with rage. He approached the car slowly, deliberately, a hunting rifle back in his hands. "It is over, Miss Maxwell," he said, his voice cold and menacing. "You shouldn't have come here." As he raised the rifle again, Ava noticed something in the distance, a faint light flickering from a small, dilapidated building tucked away amongst the trees. A building she hadn't noticed before, and then she heard a voice, a weak, desperate plea carried on the wind. "Help me." The voice was familiar, hauntingly familiar. "Elsie," Ava whispered, her voice barely audible. Caleb froze, his eyes widening with alarm. He turned his gaze towards the building, his face betraying a flicker of fear. "No," he breathed. "It is impossible." Ava realized the building wasn't abandoned. It was a cabin smaller and more secluded than Caleb's, and it appeared to be a prison. Elsie Miller was still alive, held captive somewhere within those walls. Caleb hadn't silenced her completely. He'd hidden her away, and Ava, wounded and cornered, had just stumbled upon the truth and a new terrifying challenge. The word Elsie hung in the frigid air, a beacon of desperate hope amidst the surrounding dread. Caleb's momentary shock bought Ava a precious few seconds. She used them to wrench open the car door and scramble away, ignoring the searing pain in her arm. Remembering Sheriff Brody's dismissive attitude, she risked a call to dispatch, requesting backup and emphasizing the urgency. To her surprise, a different voice answered Deputy Miller, Brody's second-in-command. She sounded skeptical, but agreed to respond. It took an agonizing 30 minutes for Deputy Miller and 2 state troopers to arrive, their flashing lights slicing through the darkness. Miller, a woman with a pragmatic demeanor and steely gaze, listened intently to Ava's frantic account, her initial skepticism slowly giving way to grim determination. "All right, Ms. Maxwell," she said, her voice clipped and efficient. "Let's go get Elsie." The raid on Caleb's cabin was swift and decisive. They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, surrounding the building before breaching the door. Caleb, still clutching the hunting rifle, offered minimal resistance. He was disarmed quickly and taken into custody, his face a mask of defeated rage. "You'll never understand," he muttered as they cuffed him. "You'll never understand what we're protecting." They found Elsie Miller in a small, sparsely furnished room at the back of the cabin. She was frail and emaciated, her eyes hollow and haunted, but alive. She was chained to a radiator, her movements restricted by years of captivity. "It is all right," Ava said, kneeling beside her, carefully unlocking the chains. "You're safe now." Elsie looked at her with a flicker of recognition, her lips trembling. You found me." The state troopers immediately called for medical assistance. As paramedics tended to Elsie, Ava sat with her, offering words of comfort and a warm blanket. Elsie's body was weak, but her mind was surprisingly sharp. He kept me hidden," Elsie whispered, her voice raspy with disuse. "Said I was too dangerous, that I knew too much." Over the next few hours, with Deputy Miller gently prompting her, Elsie began to unravel the truth. The ceremony, it turned out, wasn't about appeasing a mountain deity. It was about controlling St. Elmo. The early settlers, driven by greed and a thirst for power, had discovered a unique mineral within the mine, a rare earth element, with subtle but powerful psychoactive properties. They'd realized that prolonged exposure to the mineral could induce a state of heightened suggestibility and unwavering loyalty. The offering wasn't a sacrifice to a god, but a carefully selected individual exposed to concentrated levels of the mineral during the solstice ceremony. The intent was to create a devoted follower, a guardian of the mine and its secrets. Sarah Jenkins had discovered the truth about the mineral as well. She wasn't a victim, but a promising recruit. Caleb and his followers had believed she was the perfect candidate, intelligent, ambitious, and eager to uncover the mysteries of St. Elmo. Elsie, however, learned the full extent of their plan and attempted to expose them. That is when Caleb locked her away, determined to silence her forever. He wanted to control people's minds, Elsie said, tears streaming down her face. To create a perfect little town, free from outside influence. But it wasn't about community. It was about domination. The details were horrifying. Generations of St. Elmo residents had been unknowingly subjected to the effects of the mineral, their thoughts and actions subtly manipulated by a secretive group determined to maintain their control. Sheriff Brody, Elsie revealed. Deputy Miller, visibly shaken by Elsie's revelations, immediately dispatched officers to arrest Brody and several other prominent members of the community. The truth, once unleashed, spread through St. Elmo like wildfire. Residents, long accustomed to silence and secrecy, began to question everything they thought they knew. Ava spent the next few days assisting with the investigation, documenting the evidence and providing a voice for Elsie. The town was in turmoil, grappling with the enormity of the betrayal. Many expressed shock and disbelief, while others admitted they'd always sensed something was wrong, something hidden beneath the surface. We were all asleep, Old Man Hemlock confessed to Ava, his voice filled with regret. We let them control us. We were too afraid to speak up. The mine was sealed, the mineral confiscated. Caleb Harding, facing multiple charges including kidnapping and conspiracy, remained silent, his fanaticism undeterred. He still believed he was doing what was necessary to protect St. Elmo. As the dust began to settle, Ava prepared to leave. She'd achieved what she set out to do: uncover the truth about Sarah Jenkins' disappearance and expose the dark secrets of St. Elmo. But the experience had left her shaken, haunted by the echoes of the past. She sat in the rented Ford Escape, ready to drive away, when her phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. St. Elmo is just the beginning. The pattern repeats. Look to Havenwood. You've only scratched the surface. A chill ran down Ava's spine. Havenwood. She didn't recognize the name, but the message's ominous tone sent a shiver of dread through her. It implied that the events in St. Elmo weren't isolated, that a larger, more sinister force was at play. She stared at the message, her mind racing. Had she stumbled upon something far bigger than she imagined? Was she about to embark on a new, even more dangerous investigation? She glanced back at St. Elmo, its decaying buildings silhouetted against the darkening sky. The town was still shrouded in secrets, but now, at least, the truth had a fighting chance. She started the engine, put the car in gear, and headed towards the highway, a sense of foreboding settling over her. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but Ava knew she couldn't turn back. The pattern, whatever it was, needed to be broken, and she was the one who had to break it. The release of Lingering Silence, Ava's podcast episode detailing the events in St. Elmo, was a watershed moment. It wasn't just a true crime story. It was an exposé, a revelation, a reckoning. The episode went viral, garnering critical acclaim and sparking a national conversation about manipulation, control, and the dangers of unchecked power. Listeners lauded Ava's meticulous research, her empathetic storytelling, and her unwavering commitment to the truth. For the first time in a long time, Ava felt a sense of purpose, of vindication. The Harding case, the public criticism, the relentless self-doubt, it all seemed distant now, overshadowed by the impact of her work in St. Elmo. She'd redeemed herself. Not just professionally, but personally. She found that confronting the darkness in others had somehow illuminated her own path. Months later, Ava returned to St. Elmo. The winter had passed, and spring was slowly awakening the landscape. The town hadn't undergone a dramatic transformation, but there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. A fragile peace had settled over the community, though the weight of the past remained, etched onto the faces of the residents. She found Deputy Miller, now the acting sheriff, overseeing the cleanup of the abandoned mine. The entrance had been sealed, the surrounding area secured. "It is going to take a long time for this town to heal," Miller said, offering a weary smile. "But they're trying. They're finally talking to each other, acknowledging what happened." Ava visited Elsie Miller, who was slowly recovering in a care facility in a neighboring town. Elsie's eyes, though still haunted, held a glimmer of hope. She testified against Caleb Harding and the other conspirators, providing crucial evidence that led to their convictions. "Thank you," Elsie whispered, gripping Ava's hand. "You gave me my voice back. You gave me a chance to finally tell the truth." Ava spent a day wandering through St. Elmo, revisiting the places that had held such significance during her investigation. The claim jumper, now closed permanently, stood as a silent reminder of the secrets it had concealed. Elmo Hotel, with its decaying facade and eerie silence, felt less menacing now, as if the darkness had been lifted. She paused in front of the cabin in the mountains, the scene of her terrifying confrontation with Caleb Harding. It was empty now, stripped bare of its sinister contents. A weathered sign had been placed on the property. "Condemned. Do not enter." As Ava stood there reflecting on everything that had happened, she realized that St. Elmo wasn't just a case she'd investigated. It was a turning point in her life. She'd learned to trust her instincts, to confront her fears, and to never give up on the pursuit of truth. She understood that even in the darkest corners of the world, hope could prevail. Back in her apartment, Ava found herself drawn to Elsie's diary, which she'd carefully preserved. She began to reread the entries, paying closer attention to the details she'd previously overlooked. It wasn't just the story of St. Elmo that Elsie had documented. It was a pattern, a series of unsettling coincidences that seemed to connect the town to something larger, something more sinister. She opened her laptop and began to search for information about the symbols Elsie had drawn in the margins of her diary. Strange, geometric patterns that seemed to recur throughout the text. She discovered that the symbols weren't unique to St. Elmo. They appeared in historical records related to other unsolved disappearances across the American West, in abandoned mining towns in Nevada, forgotten settlements in Arizona, and remote communities in Montana. A cold dread washed over her. The message she reread, the text received after exposing St. Elmo's horrors. St. Elmo is just the beginning. The pattern repeats. Look to heavenward, you've only scratched the surface. She clicked on a link she had saved from her initial search. It led to a digital image of a historical document, a weathered photograph of a rock formation in Wyoming. Scrawled on the back of the image, etched into the stone, was a symbol identical to the one in Elsie's diary. Ava frowned, scrolling through the details of the Wyoming missing persons case. The victim, a young botanist, vanished without a trace nearly 2 decades ago. The case had gone cold, dismissed as a tragic accident. But now, looking at the symbol, Ava felt a chilling sense of recognition. She opened a new document on her laptop and began typing. Case file, Havenwood. The words felt heavy, laden with foreboding. She wasn't ready to dive into another investigation, but she knew she couldn't ignore the pattern. The final shot of the episode lingered on the text message, the cryptic warning hanging in the air. The symbol, a stark, geometric shape, loomed large on the screen, a silent promise of more secrets to uncover, more darkness to confront. The lingering silence of St. Elmo had been broken, but a new whisper, a new chilling echo, had begun to resonate. An echo that stretched across the American West, hinting at a conspiracy far deeper and more dangerous than anyone could have imagined.